StrayAllDay.com.
How we get rid of your passive aggression. How do we completely eliminate this from your psyche, from your modes of operation, and just completely eliminate this forever? I'm glad you asked. We started this in yesterday's episode. Today we will continue in part 2 of our series. So let's pick up right where we left off on point number 4. How to eliminate your passive aggression. Number 4, stop using vague language. Now, this one right here is just as much a communication skill, like a tangible skill, as it is a mentality. It's a mentality in that people often will use vague language on purpose to avoid accountability or ownership of a situation. But it's also that people will use vague language when they don't want to communicate what they really think. So they'll use vague language to give themselves some form of plausible deniability. And I'll explain what that means later on. Now, everyone is not a wordsmith, and not everyone is super articulate with their language. Most adult human beings are pretty good at articulating where they stand on something in such a way that everybody can understand where you stand, even if you're not great with words. Which means anytime I see someone using vague language, vague communication, especially in something that they may not be in favor of or something that they're not completely aligned with, or they're just straight up against it, I read that as them really not wanting to be involved, but they don't want to say it so directly, usually out of fear of disappointment or simply looking to avoid a possible confrontational situation. This is usually what I see when someone is using vague language. They just don't want to confront someone. They don't want negative energies to come up or negative emotions to be stirred up either in them or the person they're talking to. And they just don't want to say what's real, because what's real is they're just not as bought into a thing as somebody else may be bought into. To that, I say this: stop trying to avoid it. Don't try to avoid it. If there's something that you don't want to be involved in and you are just holding back on saying that, I will tell you that most of the people you're dealing with, they are just as afraid as you are of such a conversation. And if you are willing to confront someone with how you really feel, they will usually follow your lead rather than attack you in defense. They usually follow your lead and say, well, I'm glad you brought that up. I appreciate you bringing that up. I respect you bringing that up. And even if they do attack you in defense, at least now you become battle tested and have experience of dealing with this kind of stuff. And you'll be better prepared to deal with it the next time it happens, because it will happen. If you're the type of person to tell someone how you really feel, even if how you really feel is going to go against the grain of how they feel or how they thought you might or should feel, you might as well learn to control the situation instead of having the situation ambush you and surprise you. And you can initiate the exchange of telling the disappointing thing rather than being on the receiving end of it, because again, you were using vague language and someone wasn't quite sure where you stood. Now they're mad at you because they didn't understand you, and you were using language intended to be not understood properly. See, that's when they're initiating with you. Leaders initiate, folks. You go first. You initiate the conversation that needs to be had by saying what it is that you need to say, and then they can follow behind you and they can say what they need to say. But if you're the one who initiates, you've already put yourself into a leadership position, and people respect that even if they are disappointed by it at first. In the long run, people will respect it because at least you said something and you didn't just quietly go away or quietly just fall back. These days, we have this thing called ghosting. All of you have heard of ghosting. Maybe some of you have done your fair share of ghosting other people, or maybe you have been ghosted. I'm sure all of you have been ghosted on some level. I have people who work with me and work on Your Game University who went and tried to hire freelancers, and they hire a person and they get ghosted by the person that they hired, a freelancer. And people ghost in dating, I hear these days. I'm the type of person who, when I was on the open and active dating market, if I decided I wasn't going to date a woman again, I would tell her directly. I would call her and say, look, this is not going to go any further. This is pretty much a wrap. And one would always say to me, listen, I respect that. I respect the fact that you at least told me, instead of just don't take my calls anymore, stop responding to my messages, and just disappear out of nowhere. Now, I have ghosted a share of women as well for different reasons that I wasn't connected to on such a level. If I had spent any amount of time with a woman, intimate time with a woman, I would be respectful enough to just tell her, like, listen, this is over. Now, if I didn't really know her like that and we were just messaging on some app or something and I just decided, no, this is not going to go anywhere, I might just stop responding and she got the point within like a day or two. But if there had been some actual human engagement, then I would at least let them know that this is what it is. And when you do that, you're taking initiative, you're controlling the situation, and you'll feel better about yourself, about the fact that you at least put whatever you needed to say on the table. You will have more respect for yourself because of the fact that you did it than being the person who has to ghost and kind of run away and hide. As a man, you should never need to do that, and you shouldn't be doing it. Point number 5. Today's topic, once again, is how we kill your passive aggression. Number 5, convenient memory loss. What does that mean? This is when someone pretends to not remember something, even though you know that they remember it. So this is another form of vagueness. When someone pretends to not know something simply to avoid responsibility or to avoid any type of direct conversation or to avoid direct conflict. This is another issue that, as you will see, as a common theme when we're talking passive aggression, it can be resolved before it even becomes an issue by simply addressing a root issue before the flowers on the plant come into bloom, if you follow my metaphor here. Meaning the only time you have to have convenient memory loss is when you're being asked to recall or address something that you probably weren't happy with from the very beginning. So what you need to do is not have convenient memory loss later on when someone's asking you about the thing, is instead just say when the thing is brought up, the initial conversation, yo, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't want to do this. This is not working the way I want it to work. I'm not feeling this setup. I'm not feeling this situation. Just say that. Address that from the beginning. And you won't have to worry about bringing it back up later or having someone ask you to bring it back up later because it never becomes a thing in the first place. See, if you kill it when it's a seed, then it can't turn into a tree. And it's hard to chop down an oak tree. It's very easy to take an acorn and just sweep it up and throw it in the trash. You can't turn it into a tree if you don't let it sit in the ground and germinate. A lot of what we're going to talk about in this series on killing passive aggression is about handling things before they become bigger or lingering issues. And a lot of reasons why passive aggression ends up coming out in people, especially these days, is because people have become so just passive overall in communication. Instead of being really, really clear on exactly what we're doing, why and how we're doing it, what happens is people are vague in their communications and surface in their communication. So then when they are not happy with something or not fully on board with something, they're not put in a position where they have to let you know. So then the lack of alignment or the not being fully on board, it leaks out in small ways to where you don't quite understand what's happening or why it's happening. You think you might have an inkling of why it's happening or what's happening, but you're never fully clear. And if you don't have the communication skills to call somebody to the carpet, call somebody on the carpet, for example, to say what they really feel, and that person doesn't have the balls to actually say what they really feel unprompted, then it never comes out. And then you have a whole bunch of confusion amongst everybody, and you can't operate the way you want to operate if everybody's unclear on what exactly we're doing. This applies to everybody. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this series, when we're talking about killing passive aggression, is about handling things like this before they become bigger than they need to be. And that means somebody on either side of a conversation needs to be willing and able to be direct so that nobody can be vague and nobody can be passive. Point number 6. Today's topic, once again, is we're on part 2 of our series on how to kill your passive aggression. Number 6, saying yes in your words, but saying no in your actions. Yes in your words, but no in your actions. This is when you are feigning compliance. Like, yes, this is good. That's cool. We can work that out. I'm going to deal with that. That sounds fine. But you're saying no in your actions to where your behavior is in complete conflict with what you have said out of your mouth. Has any of you ever dealt with this type of situation? This one happens when someone is somehow, some way roped into or committed to something that they really don't want to be involved in at all, or they were committed, but they're no longer committed to a thing, and their behavior starts to show that they're not really committed either anymore or that they never were committed in the first place. But instead of just admitting this up front and saying it like, yo, I'm not really with this, they pretend to be engaged while really not being engaged, often to the point of making it obvious. Again, this is the passive aggression. When they make it obvious that they're not really engaged, but they won't say that they're not engaged, to the point that someone else has to pick up on it and initiate the conversation instead of you initiating the conversation saying, look, I'm just not feeling this situation. I remember when I was working at Pizza Hut as a teenager, there was a girl working there. I don't remember the girl's name. She was probably a year older than me or something. And she just had attitude. One day at work, she had attitude. She didn't always have attitude, but this day at work, she had an attitude. And I remember the manager was this guy named Terrell. And he was asking the girl to do something and she was having an attitude and all. And he asked her to put a box somewhere and she kind of threw the box and he saw it and he didn't make a big deal out of it, but he told the assistant manager, like, yeah, let her do something, then have her clock out and tell her to go home. And the whole thing is she was being extremely passive aggressive to the point of she wasn't being direct aggressive because she didn't actually say anything to the manager, but she was being passive aggressive to the point that she wanted to make sure that everybody saw what she was doing. And she succeeded in that, and she got what she wanted, which was she got sent home, and I think eventually she got fired. The whole point is that was a woman. A man shouldn't be doing it. See, a man should just make it clear where he's at and where he stands and what he has to say and what he wants to do. Don't say yes in your words and no in your actions. A female can do that. A child can do that. A man should not be doing this. This is not in your repertoire. Okay? This one happens, again, when someone's in something, but they don't want to tell you that someone is in something, but they're not in, and they don't want to tell you that they're not in. So they pretend to be engaged while they're really not engaged, and they make it obvious to the point that everybody sees it and their communication is nonverbal. As a man, you need to be willing and able to get verbal in saying where you really stand and how you really feel about things, even if you think it may be disappointing to others. The problem with this behavior is that often most of the people you're dealing with are just as passive aggressive as you are, so nobody points out anything. And then the one person who's willing to point things out to everybody else in the room, they get looked at as if they're crazy because they're the only one who's willing to keep it real and point things out to everybody's faces and make everybody actually have the fucking conversation. Now, how do I know this? I know this because I'm the type of person who will say to everybody in the room, like, hey, is something going on here? Ain't nobody saying shit. How about we just have the fucking conversation? And nobody's saying anything. And then when I say it, everybody in the room is looking at me like I'm the one crazy because I'm the one who fucking says something, even though it's clear what the hell is going on. My sophomore year of college, our coach had us do this exercise. It was a brilliant exercise he came up with because it actually illustrated one of the problems we were having. He took this story, he came up with this story that he found somewhere. He wrote a little snippet of the story on an index card, and he gave everybody in the room like 2 or 3 of the index cards. So all the index cards put together would become the story, but it was all split up into different pieces. So the story wasn't pieced together. It was just broken up into pieces and everyone had a different part of the story. And the coach says, okay, I'm gonna give all of you, he had all the players in the room. He said, I'm gonna give all of you like 10 minutes to put the story together. Y'all just talk about what you have. And then after 10 minutes, y'all gonna appoint one person to read out the whole story of what the story is. So he gives us the 10 minutes, and the more vocal guys on the team, they start talking and they're pretty much dominating the conversation and saying this and this, and people are throwing their stuff out and all of that. And the 10 minutes are almost up. And the coach is like, yeah, I got 1 minute left. And then finally one of the upperclassmen is like, all right, so this is the story we're going to tell. This happened and this happened and this happened. And he had pretty much pieced together the story. And he said, all right, are we ready with that? And the player was like, we ready? And half the players in the room were like, yeah. And half the players on our team didn't say shit. They were just quiet guys who never talked. And they didn't say anything. So they're about to push this story through to the coach. And I said, wait a minute, before we do that, wait a minute. And I said, wait a minute. A couple guys in the room, you heard the loud exhales, like, oh, this guy here, what's he gonna say? So I said, is there anybody in the room who has anything on one of their index cards that is in conflict with the story that we're about to give to the coach? And this white guy on the team named Kevin, he was one of the quiet guys who never talked. He would never speak up and make everybody else be quiet. He wasn't that type of guy. He spoke up and he said, well, I have this on my card. And the thing that he had on his card completely invalidated the entire story that we were about to tell. In other words, we were about to fail the exercise because one of the pieces on that card that Kevin had was not the story that we were about to tell. And all of the more vocal guys in the room, they started to get mad at Kevin and get annoyed at Kevin, like, yo, Kevin, why didn't you say anything? You're sitting here listening to us talk. Why you ain't say nothing? And the coach interrupted all of us. He interrupted the cacophony of this conversation here. And he said, well, what actually got learned in this exercise? And nobody was saying anything. And I said, well, what clearly got learned in this exercise is that there's some people in this room who need to shut the fuck up. And there's some people in this room who need to speak up. And the coach nodded his head. He got the point. Half the people in the room didn't even, I think the quiet guys knew, but they weren't going to say anything because they weren't the type to say something that might disturb the more talkative guys. And the more talkative guys, these guys weren't the deepest intellectuals, let's just call it that. And they didn't even understand what the hell had just happened. And what I said was actually what was real. And I think half the people in the room agreed with what I was saying, but they would never say it. And then the other half the people in the room would say anything, but they didn't understand what I understood. So whatever they said wasn't going to make sense. So being that I was the one person in the room who could both understand it and was willing to say it, people were looking at me like I was crazy. And this is what happens when you're the one who will call out the passive aggressiveness in people as if you're the problem when it's actually them. And that's passive aggressive in and of itself. when someone gets called out on their passive aggression, then they act like they weren't doing anything. That is passive aggressive. To act like you weren't doing anything, like, motherfucker, of course you were doing something. And again, this is one of the reasons why passive aggression doesn't get pointed out in people, because if you try to point it out in someone that they're being passive aggressive, they are usually pretty skilled at pretending that they're not. And they are pretty good at flipping the table on you and making it seem like you're the one who is being accusatory and they weren't doing anything wrong in the first place. This is why a lot of passive aggression does not get addressed. It goes unaddressed because the people who notice it, they want to say something, but they know what will happen if they say something and they don't quite get it right. And this is why somebody like myself, who I can be surgical in my verbiage, I can point out people's bullshit and call them on their nonsense and not fall into their verbal emotional traps. But a lot of people don't have that ability. This is the reason why a lot of passive aggression has become more popular, because it's easy to get away with. So it annoys the hell out of me when no one wants to point shit out, especially when there's a bunch of men that are in the room. If there's a bunch of men in the room and somebody's being passive aggressive, then everybody should be willing to say something. And it really annoys me when I'm dealing with a bunch of males. I don't care if I'm dealing with 2, 3, or 20, and ain't nobody saying shit, and it's clear something is going on and nobody wants to point it out. When that's happening, you don't have any leadership in the room, as far as I'm concerned. It's never females that I have a problem with when this happens. Because again, I'm not surprised when I see passive aggression from a woman. I'm bothered when I see it in a man. And if you don't want to be involved with something, and you don't want to be involved with someone, get out at the beginning rather than passively aggressively sabotaging the situation. Or you want somebody else out. Instead of passive aggressively sabotaging that person or their involvement, just let them know what the deal is. Stop being a bitch. I mean, that's pretty much what it is. All that said, let's recap today's class. This is part 2 of our 4-part mini-series, How We Kill Your Passive Aggression. Number 4, vague language. Not everybody's a wordsmith and not everybody's super articulate with their language, but from my experience, any grown adult male can get their point across as to where they stand. It doesn't have to be in flowery, perfect language, but nobody has a problem making sure you know where I stand, even if you don't have the perfect language to say it. I've never seen anybody really have that problem if they really wanted to get their point across. Number 5, convenient memory loss. Again, this is another form of vagueness that often happens because someone doesn't point out a problem when it's small and they wait till it gets bigger and now it's a bigger issue. Just say whatever you feel from the beginning of a circumstance so we don't have to get into the bitch assness later on in the situation. Number 6, saying yes in your words but no in your actions. This one happens when someone is somehow roped into a commitment or they're no longer engaged in a commitment that they were once engaged in, and then their passive aggression makes it so obvious that they're no longer engaged that somebody has to point it out. But the problem is often nobody points it out because nobody wants to start a conversation that may end up in confrontation, because a lot of people these days are just so afraid of any form of confrontation, any form of conflict, that they'll do anything to avoid it, including just not getting into anything that will point out the bullshit in other people. I suggest you stop doing this. And how do you do it? Inside of Work on Your Game, we take the discipline of things like this, not being passive aggressive, being direct in your communication and to the point in your communication. We turn it into a process. We turn it into a system. We weaponize this discipline into dominance. Go to workonyourgameuniversity.com, learn more, and get started working with us. Work on your game. Dre all day.